will do my best. I didn't want to say, by way of introduction, though, that architecture is an artifact. I'm not sure, but certainly I won't be speaking about architects who belong to the so-called star system, or not even necessarily about individual architects, but about what was called at the time in the architectural press in America, building with a capital B, and in fact even personified as a kind of a collective endeavor of building. So building is a practice, the practice of building, and I would say the practice of building under stress, to invoke the introduction of Stan Allen. Okay. Quote, "The remote repercussion of the bombs falling in England is strongly felt," wrote architectural record editor Douglas Haskell in March 1943. "It blew apart a whole peaceful group of charming, somnolent classical revival towns on the seacoast of Virginia, replacing them with muck, smell, and claptrap. It made urban centers out of Wichita, Kansas, and Corpus Christi, Texas. It pushed the Alcan Highway into the Alaska wilderness, carried engineers and architects into the Caribbean, and blew Kentucky mountain boys clear over into India," end quote. In America, total war was fought by expansion, through massive population migrations that altered national demographics and the physical landscape of the country to produce the weapons exploding on the home fronts of Europe and Asia. 15 million people traveled in search of wartime employment in existing industrial plants, converted for defense production, and new ones strategically scattered across the vast open spaces of the continent, away from vulnerable coastlines. Entire new towns, built with extraordinary speed, commonly for as many as 50,000 inhabitants, sprung up on these remote plateaus, reminding observers of a mirage. 1941 alone, marveled the Architectural Forum, witnessed the, quote, "the largest volume of construction ever tackled in a single year." Quote, "fantastic feats of production." Like, quote, "the partial occupancy of a $26 million installation for the Army, which included 1 million square feet of warehouse space, 26 miles of railroad, 30 miles of roads, a dock, barracks, infirmaries, shops, reception buildings, laundries, bakeries, hospital, etc. 90 days after starting the site survey." It's of course the famous Oak Ridge by SOM, but I wanted to draw your attention to the subheading, which reads, "To make possible the total destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another complete city was conjured up from nothing on the opposite side of the globe." The wartime Mirage cities, revealed by aerial photography as patterns stretched across vast acres of land, haunted the architectural imaginary with figures of elusive, implicit design. The architectural press of the early 40s was preoccupied with uncovering the processes that brought about such massive transformations of the nation's built fabric. "Building had a new, quote, pattern," declared the Forum, "product of the, quote, social, political, and economic dislocations of the war. Wartime building," the journal went on, "takes place outside the fabric of normal economic relationships, and this fabric is permitted to disintegrate. Thousands of interconnected threads joining producer and consumer, banker and builder, manufacturer and market are broken, never to be retied in exactly the same pattern," end quote. Mobilization merged into the project of economic recovery started during the New Deal, and Washington policy wavered between the military imperative of centralized control and the civilian goal of encouraging private enterprise. The tension between the logic of planned production and capital accumulation became particularly acute during the war and was registered directly in new construction, as the organization of work within the building industry was responding to complex and unstable arrangements of project financing and administration. The volatile and indistinct strategic patterns shaping the Mirage cities of mobilization appeared to couple the most efficient organization to, quote, this is still the Forum, "unplanned growth as devastating to the life of any city as the deadliest air raids," end quote. Due to pressure from real estate lobbies, for example, public defense housing was declared temporary to be demolished at the end of the war emergency to make way for speculative development. Much of the cities conjured up from nothing to wage war threatened to return to nothing. On the other hand, it was clear that the wartime building pattern would translate directly into the post-war building pattern, as the dramatic wartime growth in industrial output, more than 50% over 4 years, had to be sustained for the nation to arrive at full economic recovery. The building industry would be a key contributor to future economic growth. The forum again, quote, "In the job of maintaining total post-war employment on the basis of wartime increases in productive capacity, economists assign a major responsibility to building," end quote. Here it is, building, capital B. The war experience appeared to prove what was already theoretically considered during the closing years of the New Deal, that recovery could be accomplished through orienting the economy toward sustained growth, rather than attempting to protect through regulation an essentially stable and limited national output from cyclical downturns. In a January 1944 State of the Union address, Roosevelt translated this Keynesian solution of full employment through perpetually increasing productivity into a, quote, "second Bill of Rights," which bound the social promise of the New Deal in a pact of war. To a nation committed to wartime sacrifice, the president made a new promise of post-war, quote, "security and prosperity for all, regardless of station, race, or creed." Quote, true individual freedom, he declared, cannot exist without economic security and independence. End quote. In addition to the right to employment and the right to free enterprise, the new economic freedoms included the, quote, "right of every family to a decent home." Thus, ongoing construction, the promise of architecture to come, was linked to the twin promises of social security and free enterprise that defined the American Pact of War. Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights was a declared closure to the project of the planned economy, born in the 1920s and shaping the early years of the New Deal, and the ascendancy of a new model of the state-economy relationship, in which democratic freedom became inseparable from free enterprise, and the state was made the guarantor of both. I want to suggest that the preoccupation with organizational processes on the part of the architectural profession around the nexus of World War II was an attempt to confront architecture's new role within this managed economy regime that emerged at the end of the New Deal, was declared and legitimized as a social pact of war, and continued into the post-war period, inasmuch as it was defined by the rather paradoxical circuit linking security and freedom, control and uncertainty. Quote, "building must work to a plan," concluded the forum. "Each building to its neighborhood, each neighborhood to its community, each community to its region, and ultimately each region to the nation," end quote. But this plan would have to be, quote, "dynamic rather than static, promoting change and capable of change itself, a firm foundation for progress, flexible enough for all contingencies," end quote. The architect's role would be to administer this plan, so emphatically not set in stone. Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights was a read that already. Quote, "This is the nature of the architect's work today," wrote the architectural record in 1941. "To organize more precisely, more comprehensibly, more flexibly," end quote. With civilian production and commercial construction severely curtailed by federal decree in 1942, it became increasingly apparent to architects that, as the record put it, quote, "Uncle Sam was directly or indirectly the sole remaining client," end quote. And what Uncle Sam looked for was so-called integrated services, firms organized to reflect a comprehensive set of specialized skills in design, engineering, and site planning. Quote, "a complete package of architectural and engineering abilities, equipped with sufficient personnel and an established procedure for rapidly executing large-scale, complex projects." The prototype for this kind of organization was found in industrial architecture, the most commonly invoked paradigm, and really everywhere invoked. The firm of Albert Kahn, Inc., in practice since the turn of the century and at the outset of the war, employing 400 people with $800 million worth of construction on its record. Or, for example, the firm of Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, profiled in the December 1942 forum, established in the 1890s, specializing in schools and universities and industrial work, then in office buildings in the 20s, and now small arms ammunitions plans, for which it had produced 1,000 buildings by 1942, having grown to 1,200 people. Quote, "The secret of the organization's success," wrote Forum, "lies chiefly in the organization itself. Its core is a tightly integrated group of highly competent professionals whose fields run from architectural design to chemical engineering, from machine layout to site planning. With this permanent core, and with an extremely carefully worked out office procedure, such an office can expand to any required size and handle virtually any type of building operation. Here we have a prototype of a professional organization built to the scale of vast war and post-war responsibilities," end quote. Flexibility was key to the successful large organization, founded in a basic procedure capable of quickly adapting to unforeseen contingencies of scale or program. The distinct wartime advantage of such firms made their organization structures and operational techniques the focus of professional attention as smaller offices began to consolidate en masse into partnerships in search of defense commissions. The new buzzword, however, was not so much collaboration as coordination. Military contracts required a hierarchical organization with a, quote, "responsible head who could cut through discussion and settle matters expeditiously," Record advised. Architects were encouraged, therefore, not only to engage in interprofessional teamwork, but to take its leadership, which entailed that they become, in the words of Edwin Bergstrom, AIA president circa 1941, coordinating administrators. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that, see here, the guy in charge is the chief administrator. I don't know if you can tell. And over there, he is a manager. So coordinating administrators, skilled in, quote, "bringing together other technical professions with financiers, builders, and labor in a cooperative procedure for every project," end quote. Authority in a heterogeneous team was a function of comprehensive understanding. Quote, "The leader at the table," asserted the record, "would be the man with the widest range of comprehension, regardless of his title," end quote. If the architect was to claim this kind of administrative leadership, therefore, he had to become familiar with the dispersed factors and functions animating the new political economic pattern, to be able to discern within it the workings of an uncertain and always potentially elusive plan. The concepts of planning and administration that oriented architectural reflection during World War II had a specific genealogy, originating in the conjunction between the regulatory state and the methods and practices of city planning. Traditionally affiliated with architecture and landscape architecture, with monumental civic structures and master plans, city planning moved during the 1920s to the front lines of the progressive movement for the rationalization of the laissez-faire economy. It became associated with techniques of municipal administration based on the city, reconceived as a system of interacting heterogeneous functional processes, integrating labor, industry, housing, recreation, transportation, and services. Through planning this city functional, governmental agents would harmonize the competing interests of individual capitalists in the interest of the system as a whole, securing the value of investments and improving industrial productivity. The theory of state economic planning thus emerged concomitantly with that of the city as a system of productive interdependencies. Under the Hoover administration from 29 to 33, planning was shifted from the local to the national level, where it was institutionalized through cooperative committees and centralized data collection. The early years of the New Deal elaborated this relationship between methods for the administration of the urban fabric and the project of economic planning. One of President Roosevelt's first acts upon entering office was to set up a National Planning Board, NPB, staffed by members of the American City Planning Institute, to help coordinate the activities of the Public Works Administration, PWA. The NPB progressed under various titles during its 10-year existence. National Resources Planning Board, or NRPB, is the last and best known, to become the policy heart of the federal government's philosophy of national economic recovery planning. The NRPB elevated city and regional planning to the status of what historian Alan Brinkley has called, quote, microcosmic models for larger concept of a planned society, in which the federal government, through a combination of public investment, public welfare, and extensive regulation, could become a major actor in the workings of the national economy, end quote. The analogy between city planning, linked historically to architecture, and the economy as an abstract functional order subject to rational manipulation was tangibly manifested during the early years of the New Deal in PWA building projects, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority and the new towns of the Resettlement Administration. It also held the promise of a central role for the architectural profession at the national command centers, as the American City magazine eagerly forecast in 1933 in its description of NPB members as, quote, architects building a habitation for a new social order. Significantly, it was also the NRPB that best reflected the transition during the late years of the New Deal and war mobilization from the concept of planning as state regulation of the economy to the Keynesian model characterized by ongoing flexible and reactive state interventions, primarily through fiscal policy, which is taxation and public spending, dedicated to the maintenance of economic growth and full employment. This transition was registered in the simultaneous release in 1943 of two NRPB publications that charted the outlines of post-war economic planning: Security, Work, and Relief Policies, and, after the war, Full Employment. Social Security was thereby implicitly joined to the promotion of economic growth through free enterprise, establishing the link between security and freedom articulated the following year in Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, widely perceived to have been inspired by the NRPB reports. Thus, it was the erstwhile representative of regulatory planning that now set the outlines of American post-war liberalism. Whereas previously, planning implied the development of a comprehensive system for the distribution of national resources, within which public projects were lodged as segments of a projected total environmental reconstruction. The new vision of planning involved compiling a, quote, reserve or, quote, shelf of potential public works upon which the government could draw, quote, at a moment's notice, whenever a need for compensatory spending should arise. Professional city planning, in turn, adapted to the new conception of economic planning. It would now have to be divorced from the outline of specific objectives in the blueprint or master plan and refigured as an ongoing permanent process and a, quote, administrative function, as it was defined in Robert Walker's The Planning Function in Urban Government of 1941. Quote, city planning cannot reasonably stop with mapping the physical features of a possible future city, wrote Walker. Functions and activities, as well as land areas, can be planned, end quote. No longer concerned with the development and implementation of a rational design, the planning of functions would rather approach any design as tentative, quote, an ever-changing thing. It would be an ongoing, quote, participation in the solution of problems as they arise, a continuous study and re-examination of the elements of the plan in terms of the decisions which political leaders and administrators must make in their daily work, end quote. Installed as a subsidiary of the executive branch, this kind of operational planning would be modeled on the military general staff, quote, whose function it is to assist and advise the commanding officer, but not to command in its own right, end quote. Analogously, the new strategic planning assigned itself the task, quote, to study administrative problems, to advise, to observe, but not to act, end quote. In this way, the freedom of action would be assured to private enterprise. The plan, as the record instructed architects, would be a, quote, constant activity of projection into the future, end quote, of a state of security for ongoing private investment. A, quote, constant adjustment of the framework within which private enterprise remains free to make decisions, end quote. And the architect, as strategist planner of the administrative function, would gather wise heads around his drafting table to mull over Mirage-like designs of programmatic inefficacy. The strategic contingency of design defined wartime construction. Its effects were most clearly registered in housing for migrant defense workers. Government efforts to meet vast wartime housing shortages were tied to the prerogative to facilitate private investment, established already in critical New Deal legislation such as the National Housing Act of 1934, that virtually eliminated residential investment risk through government-backed mortgage insurance. This was extended to private builders of defense housing in 1941. And the Wagner Act of 1937 that set the outlines of urban renewal strategy by prioritizing slum clearance to protect inner city land values, amended in 1940 to channel funds into public defense housing. These were manifestations of the state's new role in providing security for free enterprise in the building industry. The most significant amount of defense funding, $150 million, was appropriated through the Lanham Act of 1940, which limited public construction only to areas where it was deemed not to compete with private capital, imposed drastically reduced construction costs, and required that most of the housing be dismantled after the war. Federal specifications for temporary construction required 78% less material than a permanent house, stretching safety standards. Numerous fires occurred, for example, at a 25,000-unit temporary defense housing project in Richmond, California, engulfing buildings in a matter of seconds. Design control clashed with the prerogatives of real estate in places like Willow Run, Michigan, site of the Ford bomber plant, one of the largest wartime factories. Production at the plant began in 1941, and local housing was immediately overwhelmed by an influx of 10,000 workers. Newcomers packed into chicken coops, abandoned garages, and makeshift trailer camps, with no services or infrastructure. Sewage from privies filled the nearby stream. In 1942, when deteriorating conditions at Willow Run attained national notoriety, the NHA announced plans for a permanent model community to accommodate housing requirements, now for 110,000 workers. The new town, Bomber City, would consist of 5 Garden City-type neighborhood units, each laid out around the nucleus of a school, with its own park, church, shopping, and recreational facilities, surrounded by a green belt. The intention, reported town planner and TVA administrator Tracy Agur for the architectural record, quote, was to provide a place where people could enjoy the benefits of community life without its hazards, where they could have quiet and pleasant homes with convenient and safe walking distance of their neighbors and of the schools, playgrounds, and other social institutions, end quote, and whose low density would provide, quote, increased safety from air bombardment, end quote, thus serving equally, quote, the purposes of war and peace. 5 different architectural firms were commissioned to prepare building and site plans, each given creative latitude in its contribution to the whole. Quote, frequent group meetings of the architects, engineers, and housing staff, wrote Agur, served to mold individual contributions into a coordinated town plan, end quote. This product of comprehensive, coordinated design met with a flood of protest from local business and civic groups, galvanized around its perceived threat to local real estate values. And supported by Henry Ford himself, In response, Bomber City was scaled back in 1943 from 6,000 to 2,500 units, eliminating all permanent housing. Quote, unfortunately, Agar concluded most of the designs, like the plan of the town itself, will remain paper plans, end quote. So to wrap up, the volatility of design within the flexible organizations of the wartime building pattern continued into the post-war period, most clearly traceable in federal policies affecting the urban fabric, as we all know. In its task to guarantee investment security through design, the architecture of urban renewal had to negotiate a fine line between protecting inner-city land values from slum formation and posing no threat to private residential real estate. It had to undermine itself programmatically. These products of efficient control, flexible enough to adapt to any city, were premised at the same time upon the maintenance of absolute economic contingency. The coupling of social security and economic freedom in American liberalism's Pact of War guaranteed ongoing governmental vigilance in the production of the freedom to live and prosper, which turned out to be the same as the freedom to be left to die, undisturbed by the security of organization. Thank you.